let's talk about how we can look at an artwork intelligently, what kind of questions we can ask, how can we look at a piece and talk about art elements and principles of design, and what do we need to know about the artist's background, the intention of the piece, and how successful is it. And then with that information, with that context, then can we make a judgment of the work? Yes, so we are able to do that. Okay, so you need to follow the 4 steps. Let's learn one step at a time. The first one, description, and we make a question like, what do I see? The second one, analysis, and we need to ask, how is the work organized? And for this, we are going to learn the elements of art and the principles of design. The third one, interpretation. What message does this artwork communicate? And the fourth one is judgment. Is it a successful work of art? So let's go through them with a little bit more detail. Critiquing an artwork is like playing detective. You must assume that the artist has a secret message hidden within the work. Your job is to find the message and solve the mystery.
Art. When we hear that word, some of our minds jump to museums or framed paintings, and in that context, some people think, nah, I'm not a big fan of art, I just don't get it. Or they think of art as something that's just for intellectuals or artsy people. But really, art is for anyone who wants to experience it, and it's often in more places than we might realize. Songs you like, movies you watch, poems, theater, even a quilt that your grandmother made. All of that and more is art. So you might be wondering, well, then what is art? How do I define it? Well, that's tough. Art's been around for thousands of years, and through the ages it's evolved in a number of different ways. And the reasons for creating it vary from person to person depending on any number of factors. So defining art is pretty tricky, and it's something that's been debated throughout history. There just isn't one agreed upon definition. However, many believe that art is anything that stirs emotion in you. Now, the emotions that get stirred up depend entirely on your own history, your story, everything that comes together to make up who you are. And because of this, 3 different people can experience the same piece of art and have wildly different reactions to it. One person might think it's the most beautiful thing they've ever seen, the second person might hate it, and the third might not feel much of anything at all. And none of them would be wrong. Everyone's entitled to their own preferences and feelings when it comes to art. You know, the way you feel about your favorite song could be the same way that someone else feels about their favorite sculpture. And even though you might not like that sculpture, it can be valuable to consider why that person enjoys it so much. You may learn something about them and maybe even yourself. The term art is really just a label. Over the years, a lot of people have tried to classify what it is or what it isn't, but that's not really what art is about. It's about your personal experience with it and the meaning that you draw from it. Everyone reacts to art differently and has the potential to grow and learn from it. It gives us the opportunity to tell stories, record history, and tap into our emotions in a way that few other things can.
Goodwill Community Foundation, creating opportunities for a better life.
Okay, so let's talk about how to look at a work of art. The critique process is an important part of the overall visual art education experience. And when we critique a work of art, we don't just say, oh, I like it, oh, I don't like it. And it's certainly okay to like or not like a work of art, it's okay. But we want to give an informed, disciplined, and a well thought out evaluation of the work of art before we come to that judgment. Okay, so there are the process, this is the process, and this is the process of the steps that I said before. Edmund Feldman was an art educator of the University of Georgia who developed a four-step method for the critique process: description, analysis, interpretation, and judgment. So let's follow this, the first one, the first step. Okay, let's have a look. So the first step is description. This is an objective. Okay, also the second step analysis is objective, and the other two, the third one and the fourth one, they are subjective. Okay, so let's have a look on these two first steps. This is an opportunity for you to say what you see in the work of art. So, okay, you are not interpreting. You just say what you see, the obvious thing you see. Okay, so this is the basic information about the painting. So you need to make a little research to find out the name of the artist, the title, when was created, and the medium or media. This is about the material used. It could be clay, paint, oil paint, acrylic paint, charcoal, etc. And the location. Where is it? Where is the place that was created? Nowadays, where is this artwork? Okay? So you need to make a list of all the things that you see in the painting. And you can use these words, foreground, middle ground, and background, to create your sentence. And for example, here you can say at the top right, I see, okay, I can see in the middle, or I can see on the bottom left, I see. When it's an abstract painting, you can use these words instead of saying foreground, middle ground, and background. When you have perspective, you can use these words. And let's have a look here. The space, when you use foreground, middle ground, and background, this is about the space. So let's see. This star, we say this is the background. Where you see the triangle is the middle ground, and the foreground is the square. And let's see an example. Okay, so I took Starry Night from Vincent van Gogh, 1889. The medium is oil on canvas, and the location is the Museum of Modern Art in New York City, MoMA. I can see swirls, stars, buildings, rolling hills, a large tree, the moon, trees, and a church. And this appears to be a nighttime scene painted an elevated position. There is a town in the foreground. Look the words. Hills in the middle ground and a star-filled sky in the background. This is the description, what we should say in step 1. The next step that we are going to look at in the art criticism process is the analysis. The learning objective is the same. Let's see what we need to know about analysis. So we need to ask a question: how is the work organized? Let's see the elements and principles of design. So for that, we need to have a special time to talk about elements of art and principles of design. So we need to describe all the elements of art found in the artwork, okay? And look for ways the elements were used to organize the composition, referring to the principles. And to be successful in this second step, you need to use the art vocabulary list. So you can see talking about line, you have different kinds of lines, and so here you can find the words to use for that, and color for the whole elements of art, and then the principles of design as well. So this is important to use these sophisticated words. Now you are going to really consider how the work is organized, and this refers back to the elements of art and principles of design. So let's see first the elements of art, which consist of line, shape, form, value, color, texture, space. Watch the video. We are going to learn about the elements of art. So the elements of art are a lot like the ingredients of a recipe. It's basically all of the things that we need to put together in artwork. So, for an actual definition, the elements of art are the building blocks of art. So, in art, the elements like line, color, value, shape, form, space, and texture are the smallest elements that we have in artwork, and we put those together to create an artwork. So let's talk about our first element of art, line. So a line is a mark with length and direction. So what are some words that we can use to describe some different types of lines? Let's look at this image by Jean-Michel Basquiat and see what kinds of lines that we can find. You might see some straight lines here. There's curvy lines, there's jagged lines, there's hatched lines, where we see multiple lines kind of in a row. There is scribbly lines, there is zigzag lines, have got kind of curly Q lines, and even some drippy lines. Now, line variation. When we talk about line variation, we are talking about using a variety of thin and thick lines, or varying the weight of a single line to create interest. So when I talk about line weights, I'm talking about how thick or thin it is. So if we vary the weight of a single line, we might start very thin and then make it get thicker in the middle and then thin again at the other end. So we are going to look at an artwork by illustrator Kim Jong-ki. So when we look at his inked artwork here, how is he using line variation in this image? We can see examples of some thicker lines along with lines that start thick at the edge and get thin towards the end. Here we see thicker lines that follow the outside edges and thinner lines on the inside. So he uses a wide variety of line variation to help create interest in this image. Now we are going to move on to the next element of art, and the next element is value. When we talk about value, I don't mean things like, oh, that's expensive, or family values, right? This is a different type of value. So in art, value is the lightness or darkness of something. Is it black, gray, white? Those are values. How light or dark things are. So here we see an example of some value scales. So a scale of values would just be going from light to dark or dark to light. So value just tell us whether things are light or dark or somewhere in the middle. And that leads us into our next element of art, which is color. So how do we see color? This is a kind of science question. What we need in order to see color is a light source to shine its beautiful rays down, and it's going to hit an object, whatever that may be. And that spectrum, the light spectrum, if you remember, white light is a combination of all of the colors put together. So as that white light shines down onto an object, parts of that spectrum bounce back. So the parts that bounce back end up in our eyes, and then all those cones and rods do all their little science stuff and interpret the color. Let's simplify that a bit. I'm not a science, clearly, but color is basically seen by light reflecting off an object. That's a lot easier. What are some words that we can use to describe different colors? First of all, hue would be the name of a color, like red, blue, green, yellow. The next word that we can use to describe colors would be intensity. So intensity is either the brightness or the dullness of a color. We can also call this saturation. So if a color is really intense and vivid and bright, then it would be very saturated. If it's very dull and dingy, it would be desaturated, so it would not have a lot of intensity to it. But when we look at artworks, we can use all kinds of different adjectives to describe colors. So here we have two very different artworks by Janet Skates and Hannah Woodman. So when we look at Janet Skates' art, what words could we use to describe these colors without naming the hues? We could say they are very bright, they are intense, they are vivid, they are saturated. Perhaps we could say they are playful or happy colors. If we look at Hannah Woodman's painting, we might consider her colors maybe muted or neutral or desaturated. Maybe they are darker. Some areas are bright. You could say some of the colors are dull. So there are lots of different adjectives that we can use to describe colors. Now let's talk about another element of art, and that is space. So when we talk about space, we are not talking about outer space. We are talking about the space inside of an artwork. So space in art would be the area around, above, or inside an object. Now there are two types of space. There's space that involves depth, so how far things go back or forward in space. And then there's also space that involves the shape of areas in an artwork. So the first kind we are going to talk about involves depth. With shallow space, there's not much depth in the artwork. In an artwork, when we have shallow space, objects are close together without much room to move around. So here are a couple of artists with artworks that involve shallow space. Andy Goldsworthy and Uchikawa Kunisada. Very different artists for sure, but when we look at their artworks, we can see that we can't go very far into the artwork. In Kuni's artwork, the people are very close together. It feels kind of flat. When an artwork feels flatter, then it would be considered shallow space. So if shallow space means that there's not a lot of depth in an artwork, what do you think deep space means? Clearly, it would be the opposite. So deep space means there's a lot of depth in the artwork. And when we look at artworks with deep space, we tend to see objects disappearing far in the distance. So it feels like there's a lot of room to move around. So we are going to look at two more works by the exact same artists, but this time they are incorporating deep space. So when we see Andy Goldsworthy's art, we see these objects going far in the distance. Are the same with Kuni? Does the figures have a lot of room to move around? And we see the landscape going even farther back in the distance. So we can use the words foreground, middle ground, and background to describe objects in the space. The second type of space that we are going to talk about is no longer about depth, but it's about kind of the shape of the areas of space in an artwork. So that would be positive space and negative space. So when we talk about positive space, we are talking about the areas of focus, and those are the important parts of an artwork. So generally, the things that the artist wants you to look at first, that would be the positive space. And the negative space would be the space around the areas of focus, and that's usually the background of an artwork. So we are going to see a fun example of positive and negative space in graphic design. You may have seen the FedEx logo before. Some of you may already know what I'm about to say, but when we look at the logo, the letters themselves would be the positive space. So there are the areas of focus. However, the person who designed this logo did something clever with the negative space. So the way they arranged the letters and kind of put them together to create this logo ended up creating an arrow between the E and the X, as you can see right there. Once you see it, you can't really unsee it, right? So what's clever about that is, arrows tend to imply motion, and FedEx is a shipping company. So when you look at this logo, your brain sees that arrow. Whether you know it or not, and it might subconsciously think to itself, oh, they must ship things really fast. So basically, graphic designers are messing with your brain, and that's pretty wild. We are going to look at an artwork by MC Escher to talk about positive and negative space. So Escher was really a master of playing with positive and negative space. So as we go across the image, whether from right to left or left to right, what originally is the negative space slowly transforms into the positive space. He liked to create a lot of different illusions in his artwork. Another element of art is shape and form. Let's take a look. Shape would be on the left form is on the right. So, what's the difference between the two? Well, shapes are two-dimensional and forms are three-dimensional. So, when we look at a shape, it has two dimensions. It's got height and width, whereas a form has three dimensions, so it has height, width, and depth. That's the primary difference between the two. Now, there are two ways of describing shapes and forms, and that would be the terms geometric and organic. So when we think about geometric, lines, shapes, and forms, we see them as being mathematical, and they often have hard, sharp edges, with the only exception being circles and spheres. So circles and spheres are considered geometric because they don't really exist in nature, or at least perfect circles and perfect spheres don't really exist in nature. There's always some kind of inconsistency in them, so that's why we consider them in geometric shape or form. So when we think about geometric shapes and forms, we think of math. So geometric involves those math shapes. Anytime you think of something you learned in geometry, it is geometric. Alright? Now, organic, we are not talking about food. When we talk about organic lines, shapes, and forms, we are talking about similar to organic food. And that is natural. So organic lines, shapes, and forms are natural or free form, and they tend to have curvy or soft edges. So let's look at a few examples. A lot of times when we look at or try to describe organic shapes or forms, we don't really have words for them. They are usually just blobby shapes or blobby forms, or weird. I don't have words for whatever that is. It's a thing that is very natural. So when we talk about organic things, we don't usually have names for them. Now let's talk about our last element of art for today, and that is texture. So what is texture? It's how something feels or appears to feel. Now there are two categories of texture, and so when I talk about categories, I'm not saying like adjectives for describing how something feels, but just different types that we would describe, and the first is actual texture, and that's texture you can actually feel. So if I were to run my hand across the sand on a beach, it's going to feel kind of gritty, or maybe I'm playing with slime and it's going to feel squishy and slimy. So that's how things actually feel. Now, a lot of times in two-dimensional art especially, we have something called visual texture. And that is texture you can see but you can't feel. We also call this implied texture. So we are implying that it feels like something, but it doesn't actually feel that way. So I'm going to give you a pop quiz. This is an artwork by Damien Hirst. It is a diamond-studded human skull, quite a bit morbid, also quite a bit expensive. Now, is this skull visual or actual texture? It's actually a trick question. It's a visual texture because we can see the hard texture of those diamonds, but if we try to touch it, we would actually just feel the smoothness of the screen in front of us. Oh, I got you. But if you were actually in the gallery where it is displayed, you could actually feel it, but you would probably get escorted out in handcuffs if you did so. Moral of the story, it's visual texture. You can see it, but you can't feel it. So that's all I have for you for the elements of art. I hope you learned some valuable vocabulary that you can use in your art criticism. Now let's learn about the principles of design. The principles of design arrange the elements of art into a composition. As you have heard previously, the elements of art are a lot like the ingredients of a recipe. Well, the principles of design are like the instructions, are the directions for a recipe. So you might have all the ingredients, but that doesn't mean you know what to do with them. And that's where the principles of design come in. You might ask yourself, I don't even know what a composition is. So, let's start with composition.
Composition is the way an artwork is arranged. So basically, it's where everything is placed in an artwork and in what manner. So there are a few compositional tools that we can use. Actually, there's a lot of them, but the biggest ones that we talk about would happen to be the rule of thirds. So here we have an image by the master printer Hokusai, and we're going to use this image to describe the rule of thirds. Perhaps you may have noticed in your camera, when you're trying to shoot a picture, sometimes you see the little grid of lines that appear on your picture, kind of like this. Well, what you are seeing when that shows up is the rule of thirds. So, for example, in the rule of thirds, we state that objects of interest should fall into these sort of intersecting areas of the grid. And these intersections are generally going to be a lot more interesting compositionally than something smack dab in the center. So if we look at the image by Hokusai, we see the largest part of the wave breaking over this intersection point. We see the mountain near this intersection, another section of wave at this intersection. So we notice that the movement of the piece kind of carries it through in this sort of grid-like fashion. And that's just one way of looking at composition. There's also the golden ratio and all kinds of other compositional elements, but we're going to keep it simple with just talking about the rule of thirds to show us a little bit about composition. So now that we know about composition, we can start talking about the principles of design. So the first principle that we're going to talk about is movement. So movement is the path that the viewer's eye takes through an artwork, and that's often to the areas of focus. So a lot of time, movement can be directed along lines or edges. So if we look at this picture here, we can see these sort of lines of the stairwell kind of moving us through in sort of a spiral fashion through the composition. The edges of the stair and these sorts of shapes also help direct us kind of into this focal area. We can also see these shapes too, kind of pulling us in from the edges of the piece, all towards this center area. We can also use colors, shapes, and other elements to help us move our eye through an image. The next element we're going to talk about is balance. And what that means is the visual weight of each element is distributed in a way that makes the composition feel stable. So what that means is you could think of your artwork as an actual scale. So let's talk about the different types of balance. First, we have symmetrical balance. So if you think of the word symmetry, symmetry is when things are the same. So symmetrical balance, the artwork could be divided in half and both sides would look the same. So here we have a couple examples of symmetrical artworks. In the picture of Carrie James Marshall, it's almost like when you put lots of paint together on a sheet and fold it in half and pull it apart. It's the same on both sides. He just continued to add a little bit extra to it. And then if we look at the Brooklyn Bridge, very symmetrical if you stand in the middle of it. Asymmetrical balance is a different type. So when we add the prefix a onto something, it means not. So asymmetrical means it's not symmetrical. It's a type of balance in which the two sides of the artwork are different, but they still feel stable. So this one's a little harder to explain because it's not so visually apparent. But if we look at these two images here, we can feel that they, are well composed. The composition is interesting, but it doesn't feel like it's lopsided by any means. So if we look at this photograph by Sebastião Salgado, we still have a lot of like movement in the piece, and it brings your eye kind of throughout the composition. Even though it's heavier over here with people, the large intensity of the landscape here kind of helps balance out the people. Whereas in this abstract photograph by Paul Strand, he is balancing out light and shadow using just different values and then also different shapes that are sort of cut in. So if we were to kind of put in that, rule of thirds here, there'd be points of interest kind of where we see these lines falling. So that's going to make it more interesting. Our next element of art is unity. So unity can also be called harmony. It's another term. And that would be when we use similar or repeated elements in an artwork to create consistency. So we might see repeated marks or a similar mood or repeated colors or kind of a consistent theme throughout the artwork. So here we have an image by Romer Bearden, and although it may seem very chaotic with all these different sized people and images kind of collaged together throughout the piece, he's still using unity because he's got unity in the material and that it's all collage. There are similar values throughout, so there's a lot of kind of medium gray values that kind of drag through the image. We see repetition in the people throughout the image as well. So he's using a variety of different things, but they're all tied together with similar values and subject matter throughout. Now, that leads us to the opposite of unity, which is variety. So where unity seeks to bring things together by being similar, variety instead uses many different elements. And when we use different elements, it helps us create interest or contrast in an artwork. The artist collective Meow Wolf makes some pretty insane sort of adventurous installations in the southwestern United States. So let's look at this image right here. We can see a variety of colors. There's kind of a cacophony of color, if you will. There's also a variety of shapes. We see lots of geometric shapes. We see more organic shapes happening. There's variety in the textures that we're seeing as well. And We also see kind of just a variety of subject matter even as we're looking through this. So this shows a lot of different elements all being put together to create a lot of interest. Our next principle of design is rhythm, and rhythm would be repeating elements in order to create a feeling of organized movement. So if you think about rhythm, usually we think of music, we think of a beat, right? So generally when we think of rhythm in art, it also kind of gives us sort of a feeling of a beat to it almost. So if we look at Marcel Duchamp descending this stairwell here, he is repeating himself over and over and over and over again as he moves down. And so we get this feeling of motion of him kind of moving throughout, and that repetition of him going down creates sort of like a rhythm as he's moving. If we look at Aboriginal art, there is a lot of rhythm to it. You can almost feel it pulsing with energy with these different sized dots. So there's tiny ones, medium, big ones. Some of them have outlines around them, which gives them sort of an energy, and we would consider that rhythm. Similar to rhythm is pattern, in that we're still talking about repetition. So that would include a repeated design. We see patterns all around us. Some of my favorite artists that use pattern would be Gustav Klimt and Lena Iris Victor. They do actually have kind of similar patterns throughout these paintings. So here we can see kind of the repeated eye shape within a triangle. Up the dress, there's repeated triangles here, repeated squares, swirly, circles, little checkers, these sort of like halved circle shapes. So there's lots and lots of patterns going on in this painting. Same with over here, like lots of repetitive concentric circles and chevron sort of designs, triangles, lines. So pattern can be used to create interest, and it can also be used to help unify an image by repeating things. All right, now we're going to kind of move away from repetition and talk more about size. So the next two principles of design involve size. Scale tells us about the comparison of one object to another in terms of size. So here we'll look at two examples of size. If we look at this painting of Yosemite, we see the scale of the animals here compared to the massive rock formations in the background. And that gives us kind of an idea of how big these mountains are compared to the animals, or vice versa. And if we look at this giant rubber ducky by Florentine Hoffman, here we're seeing an example of exaggerated scale. So he's taking something that is normally quite small, which is a rubber ducky, and then blowing it up to a massive scale to kind of show some contrast. And it makes it much more attention-grabbing when we're exaggerating scale. A similar element is proportion. So proportion and scale are very, very similar. Scale, remember, talks about comparing one thing to another thing, so two separate things, right? Proportion is more of a ratio. So when we talk about proportion, we're comparing parts of a whole in terms of size. So if you think of a ratio, you might think like 1/3 or, 1:2, that sort of thing. Generally, what helps me remember that proportions are about parts of a whole is I think about facial proportions. So I'm comparing part of my face to another part of my face, as we can see in like these Leonardo da Vinci drawings. He's dividing up the face into sections and kind of comparing sizes throughout to figure out where facial features belong on the face. And like I showed you the rubber ducky with exaggerated scale, here we're going to see some exaggerated proportions in these sculptures by Gerardo Feldstein. So here, he's clearly exaggerating these feet, making them really massive compared to the rest of the body. So he is using proportions because the feet are a part of the body, which is the whole, right? So we're comparing parts of a whole. Emphasis is just like when you emphasize a word, it's the same in art. Emphasis is what we focus on an artwork, and it's usually the largest or most detailed area. So when we look at these images here in this painting by Ben Grasso, we want to see what grabs your attention right away. What's the first thing you see? That would be the emphasis. So for me, I would have to say it's probably the light of the explosion happening at the center of this building. Or if we look at Rene Magritte, obviously by making the head detached from the body and also spherical and orange, he is emphasizing this really large shape here as evidenced by the size and the color and kind of the context in that it doesn't quite make sense. So when we think about context of things not really fitting in, we could talk about contrast. Anytime we talk about contrast, think of like comparing and contrasting something. We talk about difference. So contrast is the amount of difference between elements. And we have a few different types of contrast. So we could talk about contrast between color or lines or shapes or values or textures. But we're going to talk more specifically about value contrast because there are a few more terms that fit with it. So value contrast obviously would be the amount of difference between values. So having light and dark, right? If you remember from Elements of Art, value is the lightness or darkness of something. So there are two types of value contrast that we're going to talk about. There's high contrast and low contrast. So what's the difference between the two? Well, high contrast means there's a large difference between the lightest and darkest areas. The edges tend to look harder when you have a big difference between light and dark values. So for example, black and white are opposite values. So generally when you see things that are like very stark black and white, that would be high contrast. Low contrast is the opposite. So there's not much difference between the lightest and darkest areas, which tends to make the edges look softer. So for example, we might have values that are similar to each other, you know, maybe middle grays, or maybe they're all light values or all dark values. So when your values are really close to one another and similar, it's going to not jump out at you quite so much. It's going to be a little more subtle when you look at it. So the image on the left here is actually a close-up of a human iris, which is kind of freaky when you think about it a little too much. But if we look at this image, it shows a great example of high contrast. So here we see super dark black, which would be our darkest value, and that is right next to some bright whites. So when the bright whites are right next to the super dark blacks, those are going to kind of pop at you more because they're so different from one another. And that is what would create high contrast. Whereas if we look at this image by Jan Charup, it's all kind of similar values in that these sort of yellows and mauves and oranges, they're all pretty close to one another in value, kind of all in the middle. So this image would be more of an example of low contrast, when your values are close to one another. Now, the next and final type of contrast, and the last thing I'm going to talk about today, is juxtaposition. Juxtaposition is combining two or more unlike things to show contrast. It's one of my favorite things because it can often be very funny, or it could be startling, and usually juxtaposition tends to grab your attention because it's showing such very different things put together. So let's look at this example of some really interesting architecture. So we're seeing a juxtaposition of old and new, and we also see a juxtaposition of material. So we have like this old stone facade of the building here juxtaposed with the sleek metal and glass of this new building. So we're juxtaposing material, we're juxtaposing sort of the idea of it, you know, like I said, old and new. We're also juxtaposing shape. So, this is very stoic and, strong looking, whereas this side of the building is super futuristic. It's almost like a crystal that's grown from the ground. So very, very different in a lot of different elements. But all in all, those would be the principles of design. So hopefully learning about them will help you better be able to understand artwork as you were looking at it and as you're creating it.
Let's see an example. Step 2, analysis. The artist has used a cool color palette of blues, greens, and violets with a complementary orangish yellow coloring the lights and the stars. There is a variety of line thickness and direction in the brush strokes of color. There is a contrast of geometric shapes in the houses and the organic shapes of the surrounding landscape. Movement is created by the swirls in the sky and the brush strokes used. Also, the tree creates a sense of motion as it wavy lines. I hope you all have enjoyed today's class and learned a lot too. In the next class, we will see number 3, interpretation, and number 4, judgments of art criticism. Now, to finish, we have our food for thought moment. I found this quote from the artist Edgar Degas, very appropriate for today. Enjoy!